I'm a Bureau of Meteorology scientist, and my work in NESP has been about regional climate change projections, and specifically thinking about how to make regional climate change projections more useful and usable for our customers and stakeholders. One means of doing that is through narrative-based methodologies. So the climate change storylines framework seemed like a really interesting and exciting way for us to help interpret the vast amount of climate change projections information to actually be something that's tangible and useful and understandable for stakeholders and water resource managers. So that's what we've been working on in the Western Pilbara region, and that's what the Storylines case study is primarily about. When we stop and think about what climate change information is readily available and made available to users of climate change information, it can be overwhelming because there's a vast amount of data. We have global models, regional models, impact models. We've got bias correction methods, and all of these additional stages of data production, I guess, cascade the uncertainty in climate change information, which ultimately means that there are thousands and thousands of ways in which the climate may change in the future, and that information can become sort of very difficult to work with because we don't know how to break that down to something that we can use. So climate change storylines are really useful because they help to distill that overwhelming amount of information into just the parts that are, I guess, most useful and most impactful for decision making, and they can be specific and targeted towards that decision to make information more useful. Storylines give us a way to investigate or explore the range of those projections. And one of the key parts of this case study was the co-design process. And so to make these narratives impactful, I guess, they need to be really relevant to some sort of decision scale. And that's really what we spent a lot of time on here in developing this case study. We got together with a group of people who knew a lot about the local context of climate change projections. And so together with the sort of best tools, best data available for decisions at the catchment scale, we had catchment managers and water planners working with us to say, okay, well, what kind of metrics are really important here, and can we base our storylines around those particular metrics? In this case, it was about the frequency of wet and dry years.
Well, I work a lot in water supply planning in the Pilbara, and the 32 climate projections for the Pilbara are all over the place. There's everything from wet to quite dry scenarios, which makes it hard to determine adaptation pathways in regards to a water resource. So at least storylines helps us reduce that noise, distill down the stories, and provide 2 or 3 clear potential directions for our planners, just to add to the surety of their decisions in the long run.
We are seeing projections that predict time spent in drought will increase over the course of the century. And while changes to rainfall and runoff are possible, they're a little bit unclear, as you can see from the maps that are moving around on the left, where the blue is wetter and the brown is drier. And that's because the natural variability of that system, as influenced by the tropical lows and cyclones, has a strong signal still within the influences. So we know from the way that our schemes react to runoff and how that recharges the system, so 3 aquifers and 1 dam, that just whether the years are getting wetter or drier isn't the main driver for their ongoing reliability and ability to supply, but more the frequency and shift in the frequency of wet to dry years is important to the system.
From my point of view, the storylines approach has been really important from a water planning perspective. The guidelines provide the framework for integrating the impacts of the full range of climate impacts into water management and planning decisions. Is based on a framework where new data and new projections can be used without having to redo the whole framework as a whole. And the storyline approach has really been the platform that has allowed that framework to be set up that way. So one of the biggest benefits of the storyline approach is it just helps make sense of so many multiple climate futures. As Sagat mentioned, there is so much, many futures available to look at, and it provides a way to move away from the traditional approach of using the dry, medium and wet scenarios to an approach that considers the impact of a range of plausible futures on the climate and system drivers within a region. An improvement from the previous scaling by anomaly method is the time series also supports investigation of the impact on system features such as variability or frequency of dry and wet years or aridity or seasonal inflows. It also provides a systematic approach to integrate that climate assessment in a planning process. Now, the storyline approach itself isn't new really in terms of water managers and planners or have already been using parts of it in their decision-making processes. The framework really just strengthens that process and being able to integrate what those range of plausible futures will mean to the water management decision process.
So in this case, for the West Pilbara scheme, while we are potentially looking at a desal for that area, we are also looking at how we can manage the risk of some of those schemes or sources where the potential risk out into the future is a little bit more unclear or potentially looking to be a little better for us, or a bit more opportunistic is probably the word I should use. So as a result of that, we put in other measures such as increased monitoring, increased management of the system as it is at the moment, and see if there is a potential for us to keep using that sort of system with a bit more sort of high level care and caution. And of course, we still keep on doing our risk assessments and revising our risk assessments in order to manage the residual risk that that potential option presents. And in light of the fact that we have a various range of climate potential behaviours that we actually have to counter for. What we learnt was assessing a risk under 32 possible climate futures is extremely challenging. Communicating those results to a planner or a decision maker is extremely challenging. They end up being overloaded with information, and as a result, they become increasingly uncertain about what you're telling them, and they have some reduced confidence in the outcomes. We have found that the storyline approach and sort of distilling those narratives down into some key ones is a very good approach to both setting the scene and describing the modelling that we've been doing, but also in exploring the potentially what's to come with the decision makers. In that, we're not asking just what will happen, but what is the potential impact of a particular influence and or our actions. And as Margot outlined, it's actually not new. Water resource modelers and managers have been doing components of this process for quite a while. What we probably haven't done is really written it down in any solid guideline documentation about how we take those approaches and communicated it out a bit wider to the general community. So in this instance, you can see from the graphs down below, the storylines approach can actually help us distill a lot of information, a lot of squiggly lines, down into 3 compelling narratives, which then can be used to help decision makers decide on which adaptation approach is the best for that particular system that you're looking at.
Yeah, I would say co-design is really important to that, and I mean that is an expression that is relatively new to me, but I guess is the way in which you'd expect to do something like this in the first instance, because without knowing what decision is trying to be made with the data at hand, it's very hard to know what type of analysis you should be doing in the first place. But I would say yes, that is a clear conclusion from this case study, is that early intervention or early co-design can really change the direction of a project like this quite significantly.